guys, this is kind of a weird one to talk about. Because this episode, I've thought about this analogy for a bit. This episode's a little bit like having a massive, vicious, horrible-looking Tyrannosaurus Rex with blood dripping from its jaws, and it approaches the, I'm sorry, I'm struggling just to even talk about this. And it approaches the flower boutique and says, "I would like one tulip, please." And then the whole episode is about how the T-Rex actually secretly longs for another T-Rex or something. It takes several ideas that lean in a fairly natural direction and then completely subverts that. We've got the big alien threat of the week, except they're not threatening at all. And unlike most of Voyager, rather than the primitive, lesser forces somehow managing to outpower Voyager, despite all logic and reason, they're pretty much at Voyager's mercy the whole time. You've got people who literally take the crew prisoner and then later hostage, and yet they're empathized with and treated as if this is like a rom-com. And then you've got issues of gender identity, sort of, not really, but we'll get to that, and the concepts of sensation, which are treated for laughs. And then we've got the frickin' Pon farr, which is also treated for laughs. I don't know what to make of this episode. So, this episode is the big one that got Mike Sussman an actual job as one of the board writers. In other words, there's lots of different layers of writers when it comes to a television show. The board writers are the ones right below the actual executive producers. They're the ones who get into the boardroom. That's where the term comes from. And they all sit together and they say, okay, here's what we should do with this. Some of the people who are in charge of writing the show overall. So this got Sussman and another gentleman whose name I forget right now in, and they would stay in for a decent chunk of Enterprise. Now, Sussman himself has a weird career writing-wise, because he's done some face-palmingly terrible episodes, especially of Enterprise, and yet he's also written some really good stuff, especially of Enterprise. It's weird to see that kind of a career track of both really good and really bad. Just hit or miss, I guess. This is also an episode, the last one actually, that was directed by Robert McNeil. He's certainly come a long way since his first bit, all the way back in season 1, I believe that was. So props to him for that. I do think he did a good job of directing this. And of course, as everybody knows, Robert Picardo is the one who kind of helped to bring this life into being. Picardo actually acted out most of his scenes and then recorded those on just like a VHS with the set there so that Seven could then, Jerry Ryan could then actually watch the scene and try to emulate him. Now here's the problem with that. No offense whatsoever to Jerry Ryan. I think she actually did a really good job in this episode. But she does come across as if she's doing an impression of him rather than acting like him. If you don't know what I mean by that, ask someone to act like, Captain Kirk really quick, okay? They won't actually act like Captain Kirk most of the time. They'll probably act like an impression of Captain Kirk. We must go down to the place and get the thing. It's an impression. It's a step removed. It's exaggerated. The specific points of the performance are exaggerated so that it's more recognizable. Now, that's a byproduct of how they do Star Trek, and Voyager in particular, because in general, they don't even really do multiple rehearsals. That's the word I'm looking for. They don't really do rehearsals. They do a couple of takes. But most scenes are shot take, cut, done, or let's try it another time from this angle, and then they're done with it. So she didn't really have a lot of time to perform perfect her I'm performing as the Doctor thing. She was just, okay, I'm going to watch this, and then she goes, okay, and she's like, all right, I'm going to perfect it. And she kind of built this mannerism tick into herself that was an impression of the Doctor. But again, no negativity there. She did a good job of it. But this episode confuses the hell out of me. Let's tackle these one by one. So first we have hostages and prisoners. That was a yawn, in case you're wondering. So they're not hostages till the end, but they are definitely prisoners. And yet, despite the fact that they're prisoners, at basically no point in time is their imprisonment treated as something seriously. These aren't the jackbooted kind of thugs that you would normally see in this role, even though they're initially portrayed that way, and they're in the middle of a desperate war, which they are losing, by the way, and they have lost most of their crew to these photonics. And we hear some rather tragic stories about, the Geth, about the photonics and how that war evolved. There are fascinating little just window peeks into what might have been a really interesting culture or society or history. There's so much more they could have done with these people. I wrote down their names just so I could remember it. The Lokirim, thank you. This is the only time we see the Lokirim. I don't even know if they're an STO. I haven't encountered them. You'd think they would do more with this because they've got a large enough chunk of space that Voyager just happened through it, and they have been at this war with their former servitors. Now the funny thing, this is what kind of throws it into its own little thing. Reminds me a little bit more of Space Above and Beyond than the Geth situation, despite my earlier joke. Because the Geth said, does this unit have a soul? And the Quarians were like, oh my god, shut them down. And that led to stuff. And there were some societal things going on there as well at the time. But then, in Space Above and Beyond, the AIs of that setting, I can't actually remember the name off the top of my head, forgive me, were pretty much pacifist until someone basically just switched their evil switch, take a chance, and that whole thing happened. So I feel this is more in that direction because the way she tells the story of her servitor was not that he was just a droid, for example, but that he was a part of the family. He was someone that was actually welcome in her home, and she treated as if he was a regular part of her existence, not just a worker bot. So it's not like they were adamantly, at least from this one tale, it's not like they were portrayed as if they were adamantly mistreating these photonic workers, just that they were still photonic workers, and then rebellion happened for whatever reason. There's so much that could be done with that is completely left alone, because the T-Rex isn't what we're here for. We're here about the tulips, damn it. Which brings me to the next point, the body swapping thing. So, like I said, I do have some really good, some props for Jerry Ryan in her acting, but God, I'm sorry, I've been working all day. This reminds me, I know, I work every day. This reminds me of the reverse undead situation. Now, I've actually thought of this before, but it was really done justice in a webcomic of all things called Order of the Stick, where there's an individual who was a human, and he was pretty evil, but he was kind of affably evil, he was just, ha ha ha, that's fun. And then he becomes a lich. And the comic actually bothers to go into the fact that he no longer has a sense of taste, among other things. He can't feel, he can't touch, all that fun stuff. And him losing his sense of taste basically completely twists his personality. All of a sudden, one of the only things that made his life worthwhile is gone. It was a big moment for the character. I mention that because I've done some of my own works, in my own literary works, because, I write about undeath so often, that it's one of those things you have to get used to, is the idea of no longer being able to do something so incredibly simple as taste. Pirates of the Caribbean even did a thing about that. Barbossa constantly having that apple, and how much he wants to enjoy the sensation of eating an apple again, So it's not exactly an unknown concept, but this is the reverse of that. Imagine you've never had a sense of taste, and for the first time you do. You have a sense of taste and smell, and he describes things in fairly cold, medical terminology, but he is fascinated by being a biological person and experiencing what that means to him. It's an interesting take on it that they do nothing with, other than the fact that he overindulges and she needs to stop being so uptight. This is why I kind of call this a rom-com episode, because that's exactly the presentation of the episode as a whole. It's not about the threat of the week, it's not about the aliens, it's not about the culture, it's not about the ethical problems that are brought up by the episode, it's not about anything else. It's not about the medical drama with Tuvok, none of that matters. This is all about the Doctor and Seven being two extremes, despite the fact that both of their personalities don't lean towards those extremes at this point of their character development, and then trying to meet in the middle by the end with the pat ending in the coda. Despite the fact that he's kind of horrible, in my opinion, in this episode. He really does absolutely overindulge when he's in her body, just my opinion. And I don't like that. I think it's taking something serious and making it into a joke. Now, that can work. I mean, not everything has to be serious. I feel like I've said this like 3 times today as I've been going through these Voyager episodes, but not everything has to be serious, but this takes something that is fairly serious especially when it comes to Seven in particular. Any person, regardless of gender, age, or anything, having someone else forcefully take over their body while they are aware of it, even if it's a benevolent, I allow you this thing, is still going to be kind of traumatizing. And yet, in this case, it's much, much worse because Seven was a Borg. She knows through direct personal experience what it's like to be fully aware of not being in control of yourself. Because that's what it is to be a Borg. This has been established for years and years and years. All the way going back to Locutus, really. We know that to be a Borg means you are fully aware of everything that's happening. You just can't do anything about it because the Borg basically have you on the strings. Right? So why was that used for comedy in this case? I mean, let's just look at some of these. So we've got the Tuvok situation. This is the Ponfar. Something that honestly probably should have come up. Well, let's be blunt, pretty much one of the first things that should have happened when Voyager, it was clear that Voyager was stuck out here was, okay, we need to deal with the Vulcan situation because there are more than one Vulcan on board Voyager. This is an issue. The last time the Ponfar thing came up, it got an entire episode to it. It was kind of an episode, but still, it was a serious enough problem, and it took a while for them to even know what was going on because the Ponfar was that much of a secret, even medically. I'm with that. That makes a degree of sense. In this case, it's treated quite literally for laughs. It's almost slapstick in terms of its laughter style, which is probably why I'm not against it, because there's nothing smart about the laughter. He's finally found a solution. Tom Paris has respectfully understood Tuvok's desire for privacy. He's not going to share what's going on. He understands that Tuvok needs something in order to be taken care of. The medicine that has been prepared is not working. He needs some way to make this work. Tom comes up with the idea, hologram of your wife. It's probably one of the only ways we can make this work. I won't tell anyone. We'll make this work, right? Then, of course, the holodeck have to be shut off. Because, and it has to be shut off right as Tuvok's starting. Basically blue-ballsing Tuvok. Except, in this case, it's not just hilarious, it's actually also life-threatening, if you remember how the Ponfar works. But no, it's okay. It's okay. It's so funny to take this life-threatening issue that's a major part of Vulcan culture and turn it into a slapstick gag. And then, of course, Neelix and Janeway rub it in. I could barely tolerate that scene. Then, of course, we have the fact that the action sequences are so boring. I hate to say that Voyager has never exactly been good with its space action. Very rarely have they pulled it off properly, but it felt like I was just... Okay. And then they put on a tractor beam. Then they shoot out the tractor beam. And they follow him for a bit. I'm sorry, it was dull. There was just so much of that. The only thing I liked, like I said earlier, is the fact that Voyager basically could beat the crap out of these people. And then, I just, there's, nothing is done with any of these. So I haven't talked about the body swapping thing. First of all, there's one very brief exchange where the Doctor says very clearly, "Thank you very much for saving my life at your expense. It means a lot to me." He doesn't say it like that, but that is, or rather, he does say it like that, but that's not the words he says. He's like, thank you for doing this. That's probably the only scene that really I felt was actually in character, because everything else is just la 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 la. It was as if the Doctor from Season 1 and 7 was from Season 3. Maybe that's what happened. I mean, this is a new writer, or a relatively new writer. He's done some rewrites before this. And he also actually did rewrite on this episode, go figure. I'm running out of things to say. I know that sounds weird. The hostage situation is treated like a joke. The body swapping is treated like a joke. The Ponfar is treated like a joke. What is left in this episode? Like, okay, I mentioned the slapstick comedy thing and poor Tuvok and how he's basically the whipping boy of the episode. What about poor Seven? Like, I already mentioned how obviously horrible this must be for Seven. But even ignoring the fact that this is an invasive, traumatic thing, even ignoring the fact that she's an ex-Borg, he just wanders around, oh, cheesecake, booze, oh, God, yes, just all this stuff. I understand that the Doctor would want to do those things, but it's not being done as if the Doctor is experiencing this whole new world of existence. It's being done for laughs. And that brings me to my ultimate point, I guess. Here's the thing. This is going to be a really short episode, it's not obvious. Comedy is one of the hardest things to critique, because there's always going to be something that's funny to one person and not funny to another. And I'm really unfortunated here, because I have a feeling that I'm going to have some viewers pop up and say, I thought this episode was funny, and that's great. And I mean that sincerely. I'm glad that other people like this episode. I don't, because the comedy didn't work for me. That's the trick of comedy. Whenever you do a comedic work, it is either hit or miss. People will either find it funny or they won't. And if there's nothing else to support it, or buoy it up, or otherwise make it a lasting work of fiction, then all you've got left is the comedy. I could try and talk about the idea of a society that had become so ingrained with photonic life forms that they were actually considered fellow sentient beings, and the possibilities of a revolt and what could have happened to drive that situation, and the fact that the photonics are winning that war. I could talk about that, but the episode doesn't, so why should I? I could talk about the realities of what it would be like to have different nerval input and the all of a sudden sensations that his programming is quite literally not designed to take. In fact, it's most likely that what was happening here was the Doctor wasn't actually receiving any of the input directly. Seven was, because she's the one actually feeling and touching and tasting and all that, and he was just getting some of the feedback of that up there in her brain, you know? And the idea of trying to have difficulty with certain aspects of functioning as a being because he's not used to having to send nerve signals or something like that. Or maybe the idea of differing perspectives and the possibilities of literally seeing things in through different eyes and how that could affect him. Or maybe the possibility of her starting to see things in a different light because he's the one driving the reins. Or maybe some kind of combination of where they both kind of share control of the body or something. There's so many things you could discuss with that idea that they don't. What about the Pon farr thing? Again, this is something that could be an entire bit by itself. Tom brings up a point that actually goes into holoethics. Yes, holoethics. I know I've already talked about that extensively on my show. Forgive me for going into what most of you probably find to be an extremely boring topic. But how okay is it to do X with Y on the holodeck? I've talked about this before. There have been discussions about this, extensive discussions, even ignoring the sexual aspect of things, talking about what is okay and what isn't on the holodeck. And if there's one thing I've determined after seeing years and years and years and years of these discussions going all the way back into the 90s and talking about it in conventions and whatnot, it's that nobody agrees. Everybody has their own line. This is acceptable, this is not, and it varies based from person to person. Is it acceptable to, if you are in a distant situation and you need to have sex or die, to have sex with a hologram of your wife? Is it? Is it cheating? Is it violating your vows? That's not something that's a given. That's something that someone has to decide. That's something that's up to Tuvok to decide, or Paris to decide, or whatever, whomever to decide. Is it okay to do it with completely random fictional constructs? Or how about ones based off of a coworker, or what have you? This kind of goes into the Barclay thing, which we'll be talking about more when we get to TNG. You know, that's not discussed at all, of course. But it does bring up an interesting question. If that kind of a thing works in general, why didn't that work back in any of the other instances where that could have worked? Although, maybe that does work. Maybe that is actually what they do when it comes to something like this. Maybe they have the holodeck specifically designed for that kind of eventuality. Lord knows there are such things as deep space missions without going as deep as Voyager does, right? I mean, that's a possibility. The only thing I mentioned is, not Suter, the other Vulcan, the previous Pon farr episode. It obviously didn't work with him. At least that's a little explainable, because he had already formed a bond with an actual other living, breathing being, that being B'Elanna Torres. But I would also point out that episode was actually really badly written, so maybe that's not a good, thing to go off of. I don't know, but my point is none of these things are discussed at all. It's like someone comes up and says, it brings up the ethics of distributing medical technology based on usage in society, and then all of a sudden they slip on a banana peel. That's basically the equivalent of what this episode is. I don't know where else to go with that. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and chop it off here. And I guess I'll see you guys next time.